All right, so ordinarily we would do an introduction and you'd scorn because you don't like them. But we're going to dive right in because you've become a well-known and beloved figure here among all of the attendees.
Thank you.
And I think everyone heard, probably everyone heard, the way we met through Dana Gioia.
Yep.
And his rather dramatic, he said, you should meet Roberta Ahmanson. And I said, would you introduce me? And he said, do I have to do everything? I think he said that. Do I have to do everything for you?
Yes, Dana.
And I said, yes, please. And he called to his assistant, get me Roberta Ahmanson on the phone. And I believed you were going to be on the phone. Of course, you were somewhere far away. But in any case, we met then a few weeks later, and the result of that conversation about everything, and also especially about the arts, was the involvement of you and Howard in supporting the translation of Hildebrand's Aesthetics, both volumes, which are finally seeing the light of day. All good things require time.
Yes.
So volume one.
No wine before it's time.
That's right. So this is still in its, this second volume is still aging, but will soon be ready. It's a wonderful volume, and the first touches on beauty, the second touches very much on the work of art, and I look forward to being able to bring that into our discussions. But first of all, thank you very much, also Howard, for your generous support, and of course you all have been, are we having applause? So that leads me to my opening and question. What first motivated you and Howard to support the translation of the Aesthetics, and particularly when you consider that this is not primarily a work on art or art criticism, but a work of philosophy and theology?
Well, Howard and I are both people who think that things start upstream. And insofar as there is, we think that we've had people come to us and say, you've got to fund this movie to save the world, or you've got to fund this project or that project. But we live in California, so there have been more people who've said we had to fund this movie to save the world. But there have been others. You've got, somebody wanted Howard to bail him out of a surf shop, because if he lost the surf shop, he couldn't witness to the surfers. And he was deeply in debt and had been several times. And Howard always said, in that moment, sorry to say this, I became a Calvinist. Because if the salvation of a bunch of surfers depended on him making dubious business investments, the world was in worse shape than we knew. So the same applies to movies and a long list of other projects. But we've both always known that, and it's a place where we agreed with James Hunter, for the most part, that these things start upstream with ideas that get embedded and then get enculturated and then get given form. And so we'd been hanging around or been involved in the art world for a while then already. In fact, I think I was there because I was on a panel for the National Endowment at the time, because Dana put me on a panel for 3 years. And we knew that how you think about these things matters. And so I did a little, background. I mean, I'd never heard of Dietrich von Hildebrand, I will confess that. But we did some reading and some checking and whatever, and concluded that to have published an important voice who was a devout Christian, but also a recognized intellectual who thought very deeply about the meaning of beauty and also of aesthetics in general, was a very important contribution to the conversation in this country. And not that either of us thought he had all the answers or something. But what we did think was that this was a very important and thoughtful voice about the meaning about what aesthetics are and what beauty is and all of those things. We might or might not agree with him, although when I read my 2 books and an essay, I found that they were profound and had an impact on me. So we thought it was really important to get this voice. And frankly, he's a hero on top of it because of his early understanding of the evil of Nazism and his lifelong fight against it. So he's a hero and an intellectual and a Christian. What's not to like? You know, and because we're involved in the art world, this is very important to have a serious Christian voice in that world. So that's why we thought they should be translated.
I know that you all are free in some ways of the sometimes oppressive talk of outcomes in the world of philanthropy, which can be questionable based on whether the metrics measure things that even matter, or whether the things that you're after can even be measured in the first place. But on the other hand, you want to create an impact in the world. What kind of impact do you hope for from a work like this, beyond your personal edification and your respect for the content and the author?
Well, our hope is to see a livelier conversation in the arts related to the role of both beauty, because it's been verboten and I think it needs to come back in to be part of the conversation, but also to have a lively conversation about the arts that includes the role of faith. Particularly in our case, we care about Christian faith, but frankly about faith at all, that it has an impact in the arts. And so I would want to see von Hildebrand's ideas be part of that conversation. And one of our hopes is to start a conversation in Los Angeles with some other projects that we're doing. And so it seems like it's time. I mean, James Elkins kind of opened the door in a way. He thought, in a way, I think he was closing or saying it was closed, but I think he's changed his mind. And so we need to foster. It's about creating space for serious art that is connected to faith, to Christian faith. That's my first concern. But I also think that in a free society, you want other faith to be able to be expressed as well in a fair conversation. So that's the goal. And I'd like to see evangelicals reading Catholic intellectuals.
We can provide
and
that.
vice versa. But you have more intellectuals than the evangelicals do. So.
Well, I didn't say that.
No, I did. I did.
So a lot of the conversation here has been about the relationship between beauty and contemporary art. There were some strong differences expressed, some points of commonality. We'd be interested, and you've of course shared amongst us in small group some of your thoughts on this, but why not share with the group your thought regarding the role of beauty in contemporary art, particularly with respect to this tendency of those who want to recover beauty to focus primarily on recovering a tradition?
Well, I don't think I can do better than my friends did today. I can never say the Ghanaian Nigerian artist's name, but I think his work is beautiful. I think it's stunning, but it's made out of, it's at the same time a statement about a severe problem in his culture, and it's made out of the detritus of that culture. But I think that, I think beauty is an attribute of God. And I think that it is a window into knowing God. I think it is something everyone experiences, but is reluctant to put that name on. And in our art culture, it has been rejected as a word that was, to use the Marxist term, it was a word that had hegemony over a certain kind of aesthetic pleasure, and therefore it put other people down, and it included some, it excluded others. And also from a feminist perspective, as I said in my lecture, it was seen as an objectifying word that objectified women particularly and was objected to on those grounds. And there are other grounds as well that it was objected to, but I don't think that you should let them have the word, because people still use it. So I think we need to reclaim the word and reclaim it in such a way that it is not the same, it is not the thing that was argued against. Mm-hmm. And one of our allies is Dave Hickey, who is no Christian, and who can't define it, but it's kind of, you know it when you see it. I'm looking at Jonathan. And God bless him, he just says blankety blank, 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 beauty exists, and you can't get away from it. That's kind of his bottom line. Well, he's an ally. Now he's not going to agree with Dietrich von Hildebrand on a long list of things, but he is going to. He's been willing to say for some time he thinks there is such a thing, and we might as well get over it. And I think that's important because a lot of contemporary art has been what I call diagnostic. It tells you what's wrong with the world, and there's a place for that. And it's also done by people like who I talked about in the session the other day, Mark Rothko, who I think was a man genuinely looking for God, having been brought up that there was a God, having left that, but being God-haunted, if you will. And I really think his work is all about that quest. And we need space for that to be taken seriously. And his work is beautiful. I can't think of another word to describe it. I think it's beautiful. And we just need a bigger conversation. And we live in a world right now where conversation is being shut down on so many sides with the freedom from speech. Not much freedom to speak, but a lot of freedom from certain kinds of speech. And maybe we can open the door with beauty.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, and well, I thought of it and thought maybe I wouldn't press you on it, but I think it's important. I remember, I'm going to ask anyway, that's what I'm basically saying.
Yeah,
I'm leading up to that.
I got that, John.
I remember we had an arts confab of sorts at your home in 2011. We had a group of artists and theologians and others. Nick Walterstorff was there.
Yeah,
and
right.
We had a long conversation about beauty, and I remember that at the time you were somehow troubled by, sort of whether this, maybe it wasn't so much a question of whether beauty existed in some way or at some point, but whether one could still meaningfully speak about it. I think the working title or the working theme that came out of this meeting was the thing that was once called beauty.
Yeah.
And I remember there was a certain, perhaps, lack of confidence or doubt that had crept into your thinking about whether we should be using this language. And then I remember Dana swept in. Dana Gioia had not been there throughout this day. He didn't hear any of this conversation. By the way, all of us had been very disheartened by this because Professor Walterstorff, very distinguished, had been sort of leading the charge on maybe we just have to stop talking about beauty. Roberta's feeling a little dreary about this. All of us are downcast. And then Dana Gioia arrives and tells us that without the recovery of beauty, the world will end.
Yes.
And that he was quite confident that beauty would save the world and so
Yes.
on. And our spirits were all
Right.
restored. But I know that even for some time, my memory is that there was a period where perhaps you were not as certain as you are even now. So I think it would be helpful to understand why you were going through that and what that might say about even the challenges that we'll face.
Well, I live in California, which is the home of Cal Arts, which I don't know that you can use the word there yet. I have a feeling not. And that probably, I don't think you could use it at the art school in Pasadena either. And that leaves a few other places that you probably can't use the word. Dana doesn't care because he's got this endowed chair and no one can touch him, so he doesn't have to worry about it. He can say whatever he wants.
But even as chairman, he was maybe the first chairman who had spent his chairmanship promoting the beautiful.
He was quite vilified. The panel I was on, nobody liked him but me. Because they were all picked by different parts of the art establishment. And he actually came in and said hello to me and got icy after that. So as much as I like him, which I do, but he had the temerity to promote, Shakespeare in the schools. How evil. It really was looked at that way, as imposing Western dead white male culture on unsuspecting American children. Which is, I don't know, it's just, that to me that's just ridiculous. He's great. If he was purple, he'd still be great. Well, it shouldn't be that way. It's as if what made George Eliot great is that she's a woman. Well, that's not fair to her. It isn't that she's a woman, it's that she was a great writer. And let's get back to that. So for me, I'd been digging deeper, and I'd been on the, I forget how long, I'd been on the collectors committee of the National Gallery of Art for a while by then, which frankly is not very open to this conversation. I would put it that way, to put it mildly. But, so I'd been trying to learn, frankly, and I'd been going to studio visits in New York and London and in Los Angeles, visiting artists, and trying to listen and to understand what was going on, because I hadn't immersed myself in the world before. I'd read, I liked art, I went to art museums a lot, but I hadn't spent the time visiting studios and visiting contemporary artists, often struggling, just to understand them. And also to find out that it's not like there's a club you join that you want to destroy Western culture. They're not, if there is one, I haven't met anybody who's in it. There are people whose view of art is I would say, destructive. But for the most part, artists I've met, even though I may not like their vision, like isn't the word maybe they have a vision that I don't think goes far enough in reality. I just saw, we were in London. Am I talking too much?
No.
Okay, fine. We were in London in the spring, and it was sort of like, there were two themes in the major art shows in London. One was dealing with the 30s and socialism, and the other was gay artists, okay? So it was the David Hockney retrospective, which was very instructive. It was a great show. It was really a great show. And then there was Wolfgang Tillmans at Tate Modern, and David Hockney was at the Royal Academy. No, the Russian thing was at the Royal Academy. Where was David Hockney? I think David Hockney was at Tate Britain, and then downstairs they had the queer view. I mean, that was in the title. The queer perspective or something, and it was all art, not necessarily done by gays and lesbians and whatever other gender identity, but it was art often about that subject that went back into the 19th century, and then there was, it was Wolfgang Tillmans, David Hockney, and the Queer Eye show. And then the other theme was the Russian Revolution and American art in the 1930s. So it was socialism or sexuality. You could take your pick at the major art museums in London. My Russian friend was there, and he wasn't terribly interested in the gay view of the world particularly. He's more interested in the Russian view. And so I was getting an education on the icons of Russian art. At any rate, but I thought looking at that and I saw an Annunciation and a Baptism of Jesus in David Hockney's work. And I kept thinking I'd have time to write about it, and I haven't. But they actually are there. Most Christians wouldn't maybe like what it was, but it was clear to me what he'd seen in his head, what type he had in his head. And of course, he's not remotely a believer, I think, at all. But nevertheless, he had to deal with those themes. Even David Hockney had to deal with those themes. So anyway, the question was I more hesitant to use the word then than I am now? And that's probably true, I was. But I've decided that the word is redeemable, and we shouldn't not use it. We shouldn't give up, but we also have to be thoughtful. You have to know the context into which you're speaking it, and be prepared for the objections, some of which have value. Certain art was verboten and all that sort of thing that now would be accepted. So I think the word needs to be redeemed.
Yeah. So what I'd like to do is ask maybe a few more questions. We have a list of questions that we worked on beforehand, which is why these are so good. But then we'd like to also open this up to the audience to have questions. So be preparing your questions. We won't go on at great length, I think, because I think we're just getting tired, aren't we?
We are.
And there's also a chance to visit some more afterwards. But in any case, just wanted to give you a chance to get ready. Let's talk a little bit about your actual work of patronage. Related to this issue of beauty in the contemporary world, I guess, is this idea of whether you personally think that, especially with your interest in beauty, the goal or the mode of operating should be to move within the institutions or somehow to step outside of the mainstream and work within, if not subculture, sort of parallel cultures. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I grew up in a subculture, and I entered a profession that wasn't subcultural unless you wanted to stay in the subculture. But I was trained in journalism by someone who very clearly didn't think that was anything anyone with two brain cells to rub together should do. Of course, he was an atheist, so it was kind of, but I never had a vision to be a journalist in anything but mainstream culture, even though I came from a very separatist culture. And so I always knew what it was to be other. As a friend of mine who grew up where I did, who became a psychologist, figure out why, he and I we've talked over the years, and the last while I've been really longing to go visit again and have a long talk. Because he said we grew up marginal. That is the sociological definition for where I grew up. And, the Catholic Church has been reviled in American history and gone back and forth. In the Kennedy election, which I remember, you weren't born yet, but I remember, was a huge thing for Catholics. It was huge. And of course, as my father later said, he wasn't much of a Catholic. But moving right along. Anyway, but it was a huge thing. But my tradition had chosen to be separate because my tradition saw that the culture was going to hell in a handbag. This is about 1890, right? And then by 1930, they divided from the Church of Origin and all that sort of thing. So I knew what it was to be subcultural, is my point. I'm taking too long to say it. And I really spent from the time I was 17 to 25 trying to figure out how to make sense of this and where to be in the world, because I was intelligent. I think I still am, maybe not as intelligent as I was then, but I was a smart girl from a separatist culture, and I got a fellowship to graduate school and all that sort of thing. And how was this going to work? Where was I going to function? I was between two worlds. And so I became a journalist ultimately, and always wanted to be in culture. I couldn't understand, if Jesus Christ was indeed the Son of God who died and rose from the dead, we shouldn't be ashamed of it. And we shouldn't live in fear, because my tradition was built on fear. Fear that if you got exposed to the other culture, you would lose your faith. Well, if Jesus Christ wasn't strong enough to hold you to him in the culture, then what was the point anyway? Was my logic at the age of 21. And I still think I was right then. And so I've always seen that you need to be in culture and not of it, which is exactly what Jesus Christ said. So when it comes to the arts, I'm very proud of the 5 years I was the chairman of the board of the Museum of Biblical Art in New York City. And our goal was to be recognized by the Met and MoMA and the great museums of New York. And also, one of our goals of success was to get in the New Yorker, listed. We weren't going to get a story, God help us. But if we could get listed And when the museum first existed, it was as a gallery, and then it became the museum. It's a long story. And the New Yorker said, "You'll never be listed here." And the New York Times wrote about it initially as an evangelical right front group, right? I'm not sure how they thought the art, well, I don't know what they thought. At any rate, that was before I came along. And I was determined that we would do shows that would be covered by the Times, the Wall Street Journal, and that we would get listed in the New Yorker. And we did. And when Mobia closed, because I could find neither a Catholic nor an evangelical who was willing to put in enough money to keep the thing going in the heart of the beast, mind you. We're in New York City, and this little museum had the respect of the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Wall Street Journal. And nobody would give money for us to live. And the institution that had started it decided that it wasn't God's work. And to me, it was profoundly God's work. Because at the heart of American culture, and art is at the heart of American culture. This, it is our new religion at the highest level. And that spreads out to every level, right down to how the arts, which I saw at the National Endowment, right down to what is taught in grade schools across America, how you view art and how you view the human person, and it comes out of that culture. And so I was sad when it closed, but I was very proud of what we did, because we did shows from, Passion in Venice about the Man of Sorrow's image in Venetian art over a period of 300 years. We closed with a Donatello show. Oh, I love that. Because the first article said, "Why isn't this at the Met?" And I thought, because those guys aren't friends of Timothy Verdon, that's why. Anyway, they don't know the right people. You got to hang out with Timothy in Florence and you can get this stuff. Anyway, and Timothy wanted it to be at Mobia because he wanted it to be interpreted the way it would be interpreted at Mobia, so that it would be understood in its religious context as well as the impact that art had on, that Donatello had on Western art forever. But he wanted it to be understood in its religious context and purpose. So we did that was very important to me. We were in mainstream culture, and we had a voice, and we made a difference. I think if someone had the guts and the millions of dollars to do it again, you wouldn't get the article that this is the thing from the Dark Ages, because of what we did. So, and that's why I'm involved with the collectors committee at the National Gallery. I often want to buy art. They don't. They're American chauvinists. They always buy American, and I often think that the American piece wasn't the best. And the curators like me for that, whatever. But also, we've sponsored shows. The first show we ever sponsored was Sir Stanley Spencer, who, the reason he came to us was because the director of the Hirshhorn at the time couldn't raise money because of the biblical pictures. There was no problem with the nudes of his wife, with whom he had an unconsummated marriage. Moving right along. There's a story for you. Anyway, on the night of their wedding, she ran away with her lesbian lover, so it was kind of a problem. And then he wrote letters to his ex-wife on toilet paper. So he's strange, okay? He is certainly a heterodox Christian. He believed in Jesus and free love, and we'll just, God gets to sort this one out. I don't have to, okay? I am staying out of it. It's not my job. But what I do know is the Hirshhorn had this show with some of the most powerful biblical images of the 20th century. And it then traveled to Mexico City and to San Francisco. So we were very happy to support that. And then that led to some other things. And then because of Seeing Salvation, which was done in 2000 at the National Gallery in London, I wrote a letter to the then director, Neil McGregor, who went on to great fame. He's a rock star culture person in Britain, like the Kenneth Clark of the age now. And I said, if you would write a book on the life of Christ walk through the gallery, we'd fund it. And he must have looked up our name and figured out that we could have. And so the upshot is I had lunch with him, and we were going to fund a show on Mary Magdalene, but the woman who had written the book turned out to be crazy and was going to sue him if they didn't do something. And so the National Gallery is not going to do a show on Mary Magdalene until that woman is dead. So anyway, so that didn't happen. But then, because she'll sue and they don't have time for this. Anyway, so time or money. But then along came, I went, Neil McGregor left, and a new director came, and I thought I was going to tea with the new director just to meet him and get to know him and yada, 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 right? And I go in, and all of a sudden I'm being introduced to Dawson Carr, who's the new curator of Spanish and Italian painting of a certain, and then I'm introduced to the development person. That's when you always know they want money. So, and we on principle don't talk to development people because they don't know anything about what they're trying to sell you. They just have selling techniques. So I'm not interested, and we don't talk to development people. Why? It's a waste of their time and ours. So anyway, so I thought, okay, this isn't what I thought I was coming to. It's like, what's going on? Well, anyway, the upshot is they wanted us to fund Caravaggio the final years, which was a great, marvelous show. And measuring success, if that's, people were standing around the block the last 2 weeks of that show to get in. 270,000 people or something like that went to see Caravaggio the final years. There were 2 paintings in the show that weren't biblical images, a portrait and a Cupid. The rest were all, and it was, Caravaggio, he'd killed a man, he was running away, and then he shot, he's a blithering idiot. He becomes a Knight of Malta, and he does that great, beheading of John the Baptist for the Pro Cathedral, and then he gets in a fight, and he had a gun, because when he had come into Malta, they'd been under fire, so they handed out guns, and when they landed, they were supposed to give them back, but he didn't, so he had a gun, and he shot this guy. Not dead, but he wounded him, and he really thought the Knights of Malta, so they defrocked him and put him in a jail, and then he escaped and whatever, and he eventually ended up, so this is our guy, right? But he was painting out, to me, he was begging for forgiveness through those paintings. And any scholar of Caravaggio tells you about the difference, the late paintings versus the early, blah, blah, blah. And there's the one where he is, it's David and Goliath, and he is the head of Goliath. And he's been beaten up, which he really had been nearly beaten to death in Naples on the way back before he died in Puerto Rico. So we funded that. And then later on, we funded The Sacred Made Real, which my friends tell me would not have happened without us. Caravaggio needed the money, but they'd have dug it up from somewhere. But there was a curator who wanted to do this show of 17th century Spanish painting and polychrome sculpture, and it's all saints. There's nothing in this that isn't Jesus, Mary Magdalene, the Virgin Mary, Ignatius of Loyola, and other, this is the whole thing. And they were a little nervous that no one would come. And so they were it's Spanish art, it's Britain. They had that Armada thing and a few other, so they're a little nervous, who wants to see this heavy Spanish art? Well, as it turned out, they thought they'd get 35,000 people, and 99,900 and some came. And Zav Bray, who was the curator who had this vision, was just dying. But the last 2 weeks, it snowed in London, and he didn't get 100,000, so he was really upset about it. But judging success, one, it was 3 times the amount of people they ever thought would come. And it traveled to the National Gallery in Washington. But several years later, 2 or 3, might have been 4, a friend of mine who's an artist in Dundee, Scotland, he's an artist and he runs an arts organization, and he's a cool guy. His name is David McCullough. And he had this friend who's an artist too, was in art school with him, who's an atheist, and they meet for coffee every, like my friend who's looking at me right here, they meet for coffee every, few months, maybe 5-6 times a year. They meet and talk. And they were meeting and having coffee, and somehow I got this email one day from Cully, and he said he couldn't even remember how it came up, but they asked each other, when was the last time you cried? And the friend said, when I went to see Sacred Made Real. It was the last time I cried. And Cully said he wanted me to know that because it spoke. And then, you know, who knew?
Yeah.
And then later, I was speaking at an evangelical college in Southern California, and I used that example as Howard, don't snore at least, okay? Okay. At least don't snore, okay? No, he's heard me before, as he said to me. Anyway, that is what he said. Anyway, right, Howard? Yeah, he's so cute. Anyway, also, verbal expression puts him to sleep because he has Tourette's and he sees all the words going across, and at a certain point, it's just more work to keep up than to go to sleep. So anyway, I used to get mad at him, and then I understood. So anyway, I'm taking too long to answer this. But there was a person there who was an MFA student at this college who had a practice. And if I could remember his name, some of you might have heard of him. But anyway, he said, "You funded that?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I spent 8 hours there. I went one day for 4 hours, and I went back the next day and just sat there for another 4 hours looking at that work." So the National Gallery is a particular place because they have a deep and profound collection of art, some of the greatest in the world, that is of Christian imagery. Not all of it, but a good proportion. So they have a vested interest in it, and they have been blessed, at least with the last two well, I would say Neil McGregor, and I don't know about Charles Somaras Smith, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's a believer on some level. But the last two directors have been fairly serious. The one before this one was an Anglican, and the current director of the National Gallery in London is a devout Roman Catholic and very serious. Also a great scholar, which is how he got the job. But it's a public witness. London is a public city. 4 million people a year go through that art museum. Well, where do you want to work? You want to work for nobody and nowhere? Or you want things to be in a place where 4 million people are going to see it in a year? To me, it's like not rocket science to figure that out. So it's about, you got to be in the world or you can't affect it. There are people, I do believe, we have a person who works for us who wants to be called to be a hermit. And I think, and there are days when I'd like him to be called to be a hermit. Make our life easier. But I think people are called to that. I do. I think people are called to that. They are called because God has a vocation for them of a life of prayer, and that is a very worthy vocation. But not everyone is called to that, and we are called to be present in the world. And so I've lectured long enough.
Oh, that was a great answer. You know, I don't know whether our mutual friend Doug Brown ever told you the story of what happened to him at this. He saw the Sacred Made Real in London, and he described, among other things, just the moving experience of watching. I think he said there were a group of Muslims who came and stood in front of this Christian art in a very contemplative way. But what I've never forgotten was his description of catching sight of Christopher Hitchens standing in front of there's a Sorrowful Mary, a painting. You would know which one it was.
Yeah.
And standing there in a kind of contemplative, and I wouldn't say a rapture, but in a state of contemplation for a full 10 minutes. Wow. Before walking on. And that made an enormous impression on my friend. Wow. Who, I don't know whether he knew Christopher or not, or if it was through other circles, but nevertheless, even someone like the Hitch.
Yeah. Praise the Lord.
Was one of the 4 million, right?
Yeah, right? One of the 4 million.
Exactly. And of course, he was unique, maybe among the new atheists, but Christopher Hitchens had there was this tangible longing in him for something greater. It's what made him perhaps more appealing than the others, but here was an occasion where that longing was activated by that show. So, yeah. Well, I'll ask one more question, then we'll open up to the audience. I have to ask this question because it's something that sets you and Howard apart, which is your travels. You don't just have a certain knowledge of culture maybe from your college travels and the occasional trip. When you want to find something out, you go to the source. And that doesn't just mean Western Europe. That means all over the world, whether it's China or Africa or you name it. What role does that, why is that important for you, and what role has that played in your work, particularly in your philanthropy?
Well, another side of, we used to give more money to this than we do now, but it was relief and development work. And we still give some to that, but not like, there was a time when we were like, for 10 years, deeply involved. And you can, you know, it's not to say that you can't understand something if you don't go there, because we have a great luxury that we have both the freedom and the means to go. But given that we give money away and give it away internationally, and also, we both feel that our obligation and our call is to give it away in such a way that it has the greatest impact for good in the world at the deepest level. And we're both readers. We both love to travel. The difference is I go back and back and back, and Howard kind of thinks once is enough. But I've dragged him back to some places, and you haven't like totally regretted it, have you? No, okay. But he loves to explore, and he's interested in urbanism and housing and all of that. And one of his big things right now is the high cost of housing in California, and the fact that there's, you know, if you do the menial jobs in the cities in California, you have to live 2 hours away, and there's something wrong about that. So he's very concerned about housing and all that sort of thing. And as I said, we were deeply involved for a good 10, maybe more years in relief and development work. So you don't really understand if you don't go. But also, I had a thirst to see the impact that Christians had in the world, to see what they had left behind as a witness. And because coming from my background, you know, for Baptists, there was Jesus and Paul, and then it was a dark era until the 19th century, revivals, okay? And the whole thing in between was a lost leader, okay? And there was even a book called The Trail of Blood of the Baptist martyrs, starting with somebody right after Paul. So it had been downhill, and then it perked up in the 19th century. The Wesleys, I think, perked things up. I think that was the beginning of hope. Maybe Whitfield, the Wesleys. Finally, there were some Christians again. So, anyway, I mean, that's the narrative I grew up with. So, I just kind of thought that wasn't totally possible. And and I'd had encounter with the Anglican Church, which also thought that wasn't totally possible, because since they thought they'd been there for part of it, and that was missing from the Baptist narrative. And then I made some Catholic friends, and they were quite sure that they had been there for a lot of that. And so I thought, I need to check this out, right? And then we also met Thomas Oden, who, the late, great Thomas Oden, who wrote a book called After Modernity, What?, who was a person who could see into the future and connect. We had a friend who defined a fool as someone who looks into the future and disconnects. And Tom was somebody who could see into the future and connect. And he had become a believer through the fathers of the church. And his goal, his dream in life, which Howard says that I cannot ask this question again, and he's quite right, but we asked Tom Oden what he wanted to do with the rest of his life, and what he wanted to do was an ancient Christian commentary on Scripture. And getting to know Tom and getting to know the fathers through knowing Tom, and I had a course in Augustine at the Baptist Bible College, if you can believe that. And so we got getting to know but also wanting to know the world, and so I wanted to see what mark Christianity had made on the planet. And so that's what all those pictures came from. And we've done a lot of travel all over Europe, Turkey, the Middle East, Egypt, a lot of time in Egypt, and Ethiopia, and India, and China, and Japan, and Australia. And we actually did 1 3-month time around South America, which doesn't do it justice. But the goal is to understand the world. I mean, we have the temerity to give money to things. And the more you understand, the better you do that. And that's what we think is our obligation before God. So that's what the travel is about. And it's informed me of the witness. It's why I feel so strongly about the three-dimensional tangible witness of the church. And that the Christians understood that they were building witnesses. Those certainly up to the Renaissance. I think it's pretty clear that when a church was built, it was understood as a manifestation of their faith and a witness to it. And, when in the land of warehouses, which is Orange County, California, there are a lot of reasons for that, because land prices and all of that. But even then, they don't have to look like they do. And I just think it's important. And then, as I said when somebody asked me, it's been important to me. I didn't like living in ugliness. And I thought it was wrong and not a God and all that sort of thing. And I've concluded that God really doesn't want ugliness, and that he calls us to bear witness in every way. Visual, audible, and certainly our character is the first thing, which in my case has taken a lot of work. But all of that is part of our witness, because Jesus Christ was incarnate. He took on a body, as John of Damascus said. He had a face. And God, or as C.S. Lewis puts it, God loves matter. He made a lot of it. And so it's been very important to me to see the witness. And in Ethiopia, of course, the Ethiopian church, I think, goes back to the 1st century. And, they've never had the wealth of the West, but they still have the faith. They've got their problems, there's no question. But they have a visual witness, and they have a living witness. It's pretty powerful. And they're not rich, but if you leave them to their own devices, their indigenous architecture is beautiful. I looked at a lot of it and I thought, this is Mario Merz, the Italian Art Povera guy. These guys, he should have come down here. They're better than he was on some of the same stuff. He probably would have appreciated it. Maybe he was there. He was Italian. I don't know. But, so that's why. And the other thing is, when you're there, we aren't doing mission trips. We call them exploration travel. And we do meet other Christians when we're there, but we don't do mission trips. It's not a bad thing necessarily, but we go to learn. And also by coming, and when you meet other Christians, they're encouraged by your coming, but also by your being interested in the place, not just because you're doing your mission trip, but because you want to understand.
As I said when I introduced you on the first day, you, in addition to explore, patron, and all the other attributes, the word friend matters, because wherever you go, you make friends. You have friends in every corner of the world. And there's no, you don't just hope, because I've met many of them. So okay. I bear witness to that. Okay. And these friends are important to each other. You share them with each other. Those friendships last. It's a remarkable thing.